Hi everybody. In this year render tutorial, we're going to take a look at the creation of this scene in Twinmotion 2024. Now, we'll be looking more specifically at how to go about lighting your interior scenes using Lumen and how to set up our video clips. I'll go through all of the different sort of lighting setups that I'm using, and I'll explain why I'm using them, and then we'll take a look at the very end at the finished result. Hopefully, this tutorial will help you with your Lumen interiors, something that Lumen struggles just a little bit with. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, everybody, so here we are in our test scene, and you can see what we have is effectively sort of a modern French style apartment. There's a lot of white and a lot of wainscoting and paneling on the walls, and it's a lot of white paint basically. Okay, so there's a couple of reasons why we're going to use this as our sample project here. The first is it's because it's the project my students are working on at school at the moment, and so in order to demonstrate it I had to pretty much build them. The other thing is it's really good if we want to test our Lumen lighting setup for interiors to really work on a kind of a contained space, a simplified space, and one where there's a lot of white, so we can really see what the light and shadow is doing. So let's go ahead and begin. And the first thing I want to show you is just a little bit outside. I have got some basic buildings propped up out here, and in order to not see through these, you can see we have just this big black wall, and from distance that's just going to look as if we have actual buildings on the opposite side of the street. Now, I did want this apartment to feel like it was kind of high up, and so we've deleted the ground plane and we've just literally lifted everything up. Last thing is we have under the ambience tab, we have actually turned on that sort of background that comes in Twinmotion, just to the city one instead of the hills or anything like that. You'll also notice we have set up a lot of different shots here, including the final ones that we'll show a little bit later on. But I want to show you pretty much every one of these sort of lighting types or setups one by one to show you what we're dealing with and show you how I would go about lighting this scene. Now, please note as well, Lumen is really wonderful for exteriors, and I have videos on that on the channel. But when it comes to lighting up interiors, it's a little bit more iffy. If we look at, for example, some of the settings that are available for Lumen under the Unreal Engine, as far as I can tell, there's a lot more settings. And so my suspicion is these are actually hidden away from the Twinmotion users just to kind of simplify working with Lumen. It's not the best at interiors. It just isn't. And honestly, if you've access to D5 Render, I probably wouldn't use Twinmotion for interior Lumen shots. Exterior, all the way. Wonderful, really wonderful, especially foliage, but not so much for interiors. All right, let's take a look. Lighting scenario, or lighting setup number one, is going to be just natural light. So you can see here over on the scene tree on the right, I have all the lights in the scene turned off, everything off. And if we look at the ambience here, move my little self out of the way, we go to ambience and click on settings and environment. You can see I have just a very noon cloudy, very simple lighting HRI setup here. It is rotated to just kind of come in the windows, and it is set to 100. Trying to get as much of that sort of like ambient light blasting in, which is very similar to how you light something using the path tracer or the older version of Twinmotion, which is really just the normal lighting setup, the standard global illumination model. And what I have is set up my camera here for a 5-second shot, and I'm just going to pan around here. And let's take a look at what happens when I render this. Also, please note, in terms of sun intensity, it's set to 1, ambient is set to 2, and everything else is pretty bog standard. I think I kept auto exposure on, but in reality, you would really want to be turning that off. All right, let's take a look at how to light the scene with just the HRI lighting. Let's take a look at this 5-second clip really quickly. Okay, you can see this is our 5-second clip right here. It's not terrible, but it's just not right. There are two major issues that you're kind of going to encounter. The first is splotchiness in the walls. Now, generally speaking, splotchiness in the walls in Lumen does resolve when you render. And if it's still there when your render is done, it's basically, I think, a sign that there is not enough light in the actual scene. So we need to add more light. Now, the second issue you're going to encounter, and it wasn't that visible in that shot, but it was visible in one of the ones I had done when I was testing this, which was color bleed. I actually found that the light from this plant bled, literally, you can kind of see it a little bit, bled onto the wall here. So if you do encounter that, just move whatever it is. In this case, I had to move the plant. The green foliage was bleeding into the actual wall. So just move that away. All in all, though, it's okay. Like, it probably looks about as good as what you get if you were using the older version of Twinmotion, or just didn't have access to the Path Tracer or Lumen. Maybe you're on Mac or something like that. So in our next clip, what we actually have is set up area lights outside. Now, this should be kind of familiar with most people who've been using Twinmotion for any length of time, or really a lot of rendering programs. Lumen and D5 are the ones I'm familiar with, but same technique. Huge big light, literally just a light box outside, blasting light in. And the light used for that in Twinmotion is almost always a area light. So let's take a quick look here. So what we've done is we've placed 4 area lights outside. They are all instances, so when you change one, it'll change the settings of the others. And I just put them in a new container. Now you'll notice I'm using the light wash technique, which is really accredited to a D5 user, and it's something I've talked about before. But basically, instead of just having a big area light pointing in coming in from the outside, you actually have an area light pointing downwards, and then you have one pointing upwards as well. And what this will do will give you a much more even distribution of light within the actual room. Each of these lights, for our purposes, I've just set them to 1,000. And if we go inside here, you'll actually notice you're getting some pretty harsh shadows. Now, this may make you think, well, why don't I just turn the shadows off? Well, the problem with that is again, it's not really very realistic. The light just doesn't look right. Yes, the scene is going to be lit up a bit more, but you should be getting shadows from the outside. For example, if you just stand near a window with the full sun coming in, you're going to get harsher shadows. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this 5-second clip. This will give you an idea of how things are looking. Okay, so our area light render is done. Let's take a quick look and see how this is going. So you can see we've got some pretty, it looks a little bit better. I really like the shadows a little bit. There's a little lightly kind of effect going on here, a little bit of a glow outside the windows, but for the most part, I do kind of like the look of this. You will notice these shadows are quite hard, they're quite sharp. And so we'll need to mitigate that a little bit, but this is not, strictly speaking, terrible. This is quite functional. It's just that the shadows just look a little too sharp. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the scene as it currently stands. Okay, to add a bit more light into this scene here, you can see we've gone and added an omnidirectional light. A couple of things to note about doing this technique. Let's look at the video with the single omni light with shadows on. Now, this is intended to add more light into the overall room, balance the room a little bit more, but kind of watch what happens here. One omni light right there, right in the center, and you can see with shadows turned on, yes, we're getting a lot more light into the actual room. We still have that area light outside, blasting light down and up into the room, and now we've got a nice warm glow coming from the light in the ceiling. However, you will notice the shadows are now really sharp, really sharp. And so we need to do something to fix that. But all in all, this is looking way better than just the environment on its own. So how do we fix that? One way I've kind of, just kind of stumbled upon a little bit is duplicating this omni light. So you can see here on my scene tree on the top right, I've got now an omni light with the shadows, and you can see shadows are turned on for this little one, very strong, and the intensity is about 150. But I've duplicated that light, and I don't think it really matters whether you put the shadow omni light or the no shadow omni light. I'm not really sure it really matters about the order. And what's really important is here, we can come in and we can put these to, for example, both maybe 500. Looking at those shadows, they're still a little bit sharp here. But what we want to do is make sure that one of them has no shadows on. Yeah, And then what I'm going to do is drop the intensity of the one with actual shadows. And I'm going to bring this down pretty low and start with like maybe 300 or maybe bring it down to even 150. So what you'll notice is now I've got a nice softer shadow. They're not as harsh. And I've got both of these lights working almost in unison. So I'll still get the nice warm effect. I'll also just have shadows on as well. And I don't have to have one super powered light in there lighting things up. So let's take a look right now. Omnidirectional light with the shadows, that's at about 150. It's quite warm. And I've got the omnidirectional light, no shadows, which is about 500. And shadows were off for this little fella. And let's take a look at sort of the end result of that. And I think this will look really nice. Okay, you can see we're getting some nice, lovely little shadows under the objects. They're not super sharp. And I think what I might actually do before I finish this is maybe take down the intensity of the no shadow Omni. And I think I'll actually increase the intensity of the shadow Omni. Now, one other thing to note about this, if you're doing a room that has inset lights, which we'll look at in a second, we can use IES light profiles, and those will give you shadows probably in a better way to work than just the big Omni, but also be mindful of what lighting you actually have. And I mean that the actual light fixture in the ceiling. So my light fixture, because it's kind of got this dynamic shape of these interlocking circles, it's going to cause some weird shadows if you're not careful. So just be mindful of that. If you can avoid having lights that don't almost have a funnel effect like this one up here, I think you want to avoid those if you can. Just a little bit harder to work with. So ideally, things like pendant lights or drop lights, they will be your friend when it comes to lighting the scene this way. I'm pretty happy with the overall direction this is taking, but we're not done yet. We need to take a look at IES lights, and we need to turn on the emissive lights over here. So the emissive lights are actually pretty easy to work with. We have a number of objects over here. I'm going to use the eyedropper, and I've already assigned a neon material to them. I'm going to put them back to about 100. And there we go. And these will cast a very lovely glow on the walls. Should look very warm and very inviting. And you can see here as well, I have the same warm glow on my very fancy ceiling light, which is very cool and very painful to actually work with. Now, we're still getting a bit of light bleed going on, which I'm not hugely in love with. Lumen has got some fun quirks that I don't really appreciate. But for the most part, this is starting to look a lot better. Now, this brings us to the question of IES light profiles. So over here in the bedroom, you can see we actually have some very simplistic ceiling lights or inset lights. By the way, if you're really lazy and you're like, oh, I didn't model these, one thing you can actually do is just use the library objects. We got primitives all the way down, and we can just grab the base circle and scale it way down to like this big, and then just put it in the ceiling and put our emissive material on that. Does it look good? No, it probably won't look like an actual model, but since it's all glowy, nobody's really going to notice or care. These make working with Lumen a lot easier. You can still see we've still got those big area lights outside, so blasting light in. It also helps that we have a number of IES lights. And again, these are all going to be instances. So when you change one, you should be able to change all of them. And you can see they do have shadows on, which is going to give you some really lovely contact shadows. And if you remember, when we go back and look at this natural light environment, one of the big issues when we rendered it was that there wasn't really any sort of big drop shadows. Objects didn't look like they were casting shadows on the ground. So if we actually go back then to let's go back to our IES light scene, you can see these do a beautiful job of giving you shadows. And overall, this shot here, this scene, was very easy to set up. So all in all, looks pretty nice. Not perfect. There's one blaring issue, but I'm actually pretty happy with this all in all. Please note, these are just the actual light settings. Like, I haven't touched the sort of the camera settings, sharpness, anything. These are just default sort of environmental settings. And I'm still pretty happy with this overall. You know, we're getting shadows. The room is lit up nicely. I haven't adjusted camera or anything else, but all in all, I'm quite happy with how this is looking just as is. Now, I mentioned there's one glaring issue, and you can probably figure out what it actually is. You can see there's some weird effect going on right here. So what that actually is, when I set up the scene initially first, I wasn't being very careful about where the IESs in the lamp was actually hitting. That would be something that I would need to fix. If we, for example, click off of this, you can see we do actually have lights set in the actual lamps as well. So we got these little IESs. So you just got to be very careful of how far the fall off is on these lights and just sort of where they're actually hitting. And I think my one that was in the lamp was actually hitting the wall. So just something to be mindful of. IES light profiles, really great if you can work with them in your scene. They'll give you some really wonderful shadows, and they'll give you a bit more control than the Omni lights. Where the Omnis are going to be very good, though, is in lighting up a scene like this, where we've got a big ceiling light and where we don't obviously have any inset lights. Okay, looks pretty good. Let's take a look then at our final setup, and we'll take a critical look at these shots. All right, everybody, let's go ahead and take a look at our final lighting setup. So you can see we have our buildings outside with our black plane to stop seeing through them. We're using, in the actual renders, we're using just a clear HRI. We've got our 4 area lights outside, and you can see those right here pointing in the windows using that light wash technique. On the inside then, we have our IES in the ceiling. You can also see we've added some lamps, and I believe, if memory serves, yeah, these are just little IESs as well. We've also turned on the emissive lights in our actual scene, and that will add that nice little warm glow. You can see we've got some more emissive lights here, and all in all, we should be pretty much ready to go. If anyone's interested, I'll run through the actual ambience and lighting settings really quickly, and then we'll look at our finished result. So for example, you can see I've got my clips down here, different clips, different settings, but overall they should pretty much be relatively consistent. The only settings I changed slightly were for this video here, which I just wanted something to be a little bit better than the default, which was basically meant I had to customize it a little bit. All in all, the ambience is pretty straightforward. Let's go over here and take a look. So under the environment tab, we want to make sure that I have my sun set to 1, and after that, it's really just the ambient slider here. Now, I generally prefer this to be higher, so mine is at 2 right now. And if we scroll on down, our HDRI, you can see it's set to 100, noon cloudy 16, rotated in. For camera settings, we have turned off auto exposure, and you generally do want to do that. And we've adjusted the local exposure to get kind of the results you want. For an interior, do want a little bit of glow off the lights. I don't want to sort of suppress the highlights. And then when it comes to the shadows as well, I don't want to make it where there are no shadows or where the shadows are a little too bright. So you can kind of see here, we did just kind of adjust these ourselves. Other settings that you might want to take a look at, definitely the focal length. You want to avoid basically those lower focal lengths. Those are for exteriors. So you can see I'm at about 28, really 25 upwards, up to at least maybe 35 or 40 will be fine. But for this reason, 28, vignetting turned on, sharpness 24, 25, parallelism just to straighten the edges of the camera, depth of field only on individual shots. You don't want to keep this on for everything. So decide if you want depth of field, and you can see here, click on this video. Yeah, you can kind of see, whoop, as the camera moves up, you can just kind of see that depth of field on the chair. Other than that, I think really it's kind of okay. Render settings, just crank everything in Lumen. This goes back to what I mentioned the other day, earlier on. I think there are these settings that are hidden away for more, for basically Unreal Engine users, but Lumen, we don't really have those settings. So basically just, I will crank everything and then I drop the shadow bias. Yeah, that's a separate topic. Anyway, what we really want to do is just go over to FX, make some tweaks here to the contrast or saturation, depending on your image. I don't recommend using the color gradients with Lumen. In previous versions, I found that they really slowed down the render like a gazillion million times. So it's very strange. So just leave them as is and just tweak the contrast and saturation as you see fit. or do that in a video editing software. After that, make sure it's just set to 4K, and most of these clips rendered at 4K with these settings in about 1.5 minutes for about a 5 or 6 second clip. Now, mileage will vary. Okay, let's go take a look at the final render, and hopefully you guys will agree. I think it worked out pretty well. And with that, we are done. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this Twinmotion Lumen video. I hope you found the content useful and informative, and I hope it helps with your Lumen scenes going forward, particularly those interiors, those really challenging interiors. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and if you liked, please think about subscribing or commenting. It's really great to have those conversations with people, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. All right. Cheers.